So we pray a blessing over each and every one of us tonight, that we have a good time, everybody has a safe trip home, for Norm and Walt, for their healing and comfort, and for me, that I am guided with a little wisdom and help from the Lord here, and that I do justice to Bill Brown and his story. So a little bit about myself. I became a member of the Army Air Force Roundtable through Jim Hart, whom I met because Jim's nephew works with me at the water company I work with. So that's how I got involved. I've been a member about 4 years, and I think I've attended 4 times, so once a year is pretty good. Bill Brown, I met about 10 or 12 years ago. We were living on Cape Cod. My wife, Pam, was working at the transfer station, and Bill came in with a bunch of plumbing, scrap coppers, pipes had burst, and he said, you know, I don't want to throw this away. Do you know anybody that will take it? Well, I collect scrap metal on the side and turn it in. It can be good money. So she sent me over to his house, and I met Bill, and Bill met me out in the driveway, very nice gentleman, and he's wearing a hat, and the hat says World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And I couldn't help but stare at the hat. So I mentioned it casually. I'm like, you know, nice hat, you know. He's come inside for a minute. So he sat me down, and we ended up talking for about 2 hours, his war stories, his life, and became great friends over the year with him and his wife, visited him often, and he had quite the adventures. So he was a member of the 8th Air Force, stationed at Kimballton with the 379th Bomb Group, and he's with the 524th Squadron.
Locate Kimballton on the English coast.
Kimballton and most of the airfields of the bomb groups were in what was known as East Anglia, which would be southeast England. I believe it's southeast of or just east of London. So they're largely clustered around there. Kimballton, Ravelston, Moleston. There was 3 air divisions, and they tended to be grouped roughly throughout East Anglia, but with each air division in a certain spot in general. So Bill was born in Brewer, Maine, September 17th. He was a bit of a rascal as a kid. Him and his buddies were into a bit of mischief, but they were typical country kids. They didn't get into real trouble with the law. You know, they'd pinch a few apples. They'd play a prank now and then. They managed to take apart a truck and get it into the 2nd floor of the high school. So that's the kind of guys they were. This is the census from 1940. It lists Bill, his brother, and his mother, and the man who was his stepfather. And that is something I never learned from Bill, who his real father was or what happened. Bill always talked about his stepfather as his father. So Brewer is just across Penobscot River from Bangor, Maine. Small town of about 6,000 in the 20s when he was growing up. A little side note, the year Bill was born, the Ku Klux Klan paraded down Main Street, which is probably typical of the 20s, but somewhat surprising in the far north. The Eastern Paper Mill, it was the largest employer in town, and in 1900, and Bill told me this story, and I found it online, there's a 173-foot tall chimney, smokestack at the pulp and paper mill. And all the boys there were challenged, $5 if they could climb to the top. None of them ever made it. 17-year-old French-Canadian girl started up, and the owner of the mill said, I'll double it if she makes it. And she did. She made it to the top and got her $10. So then across the Penobscot was the Viazzi Dam. That was torn down in 2013, but Bill and his buddies spent a lot of time around there, playing, hiking, fishing, Boy Scouts, camping, all that. His grandmother had a house right across from there. It was known as Eddington Bend. And so he went through the years, living up Brewer. He was about 2 weeks away from graduating, and he was drafted. So here's a picture of the WWII Dam and the story of Dion climbing the tower. Go ahead. If anybody would like a copy of this presentation, we can give Leslie a list at the end, and I can get it to you. I'll have to print it and mail it. So, Bill at age 16 with his buddies Dick and Ken. There's Bill on the far right, and they're all smoking pipes. That was something they got into for a little while. Many years later, he quit smoking. He had a small cancerous growth on his lip. He wrote a long letter to the Cape Cod Times in the 60s, I have a copy of. To the right is the house where Bill spent a bunch of summers across the WWII Dam. That was his grandmother's house. Go ahead. Soapbox Derby, when Bill was about 7 years old. Go ahead. Okay, so there's very, very young Bill on the left, and he is seated on a little fire pumper toy truck, which carried a few gallons of water and actually functioned as a pumper. And he went into Grandma's kitchen while she was cooking on the old Clarion stove and hosed everything down and put the fire in the stove out and ruined all the food and all that. And then on the right is prom night. That's with his dad's 1940 Oldsmobile. That's 1943. Bill's story about that was he had a date with the most gorgeous blonde in high school. And he went with his buddy Dick, and they went to a hotel in Bangor, and they had never seen an elevator before. So Bill's date ended up hanging out with Dick, and they were playing around riding up and down the elevator all night. And Bill ended up dancing all night with the other girl. So, go ahead. All right, now Bill is just about to go off to war, and a couple quotes here. There's some controversy about our bombing efforts in World War II. I have no problem with it. Some people talk about Dresden. They talk about the atomic bomb. Well, we had a little different attitude than the British. We were trying to do precision bombing and avoid civilian casualties. The British weren't. They were area bombing. So, but it's war. Andrew Jackson. No one need think that the world cannot be ruled without blood. The civil sword shall and must be red and bloody. Peace, above all things, is to be desired, but blood must sometimes be spilled to obtain it on equitable in lasting terms. William Tecumseh Sherman. War is the remedy our enemies have chosen. Other simple remedies were within their choice. You know it, and they knew it. But they wanted war, and I say let us give them all they want. Not a word argument, not a sign of let up, no cave in until we are whipped or they are. And then Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, chief of the British Air Corps, he paraphrases Hosea 8:7. They sowed the wind, and now they're going to reap the whirlwind. And they did let them have it. And as the war progressed, the American Air Force's targets, like airplane factories, are very isolated from cities, and they're able to hit them strategically without causing many civilian casualties. And as the war progressed, targets of transportation became a big deal, as well as oil refineries. And that's what really put the crunch on the Germans, was when they started striking oil plants. But the transportation centers and railroad marshaling yards were in cities, so the rate of civilian casualties went up. But that was a price they were willing to accept. They finally realized that Germany is lasting a long time. We have to hit them harder. And finally, we progressed to total war with the atomic bomb in Japan. And we killed a lot more people in Tokyo with the firebombing long before the atomic bomb. So opinions may be what they are, but mine is, if, like William Tecumseh says, you chose it, you're going to get it. Go ahead. So Bill's war years, drafted 43, trained for a year and a half. Initially, Camp Edwards, Mass., little outfitting, uniforms. Bill is the only GI I know to complain that the uniforms did not fit. They went on to basic training at Greensboro, North Carolina, Wittenberg, Ohio, cadet school, which was like an intensive college program with algebra, trig, huge number of things to prepare them for testing to see if they could be a pilot, co-pilot, armorer, navigator, radio operator, or what have you. So they went to San Antonio for testing. Bill did not make it for a pilot. He became an armorer and then went to Nellis, Nevada for gunnery training. And he was a waist gunner. At Ardmore, Oklahoma, they met up where the whole crew of 9 came together and began training as a crew, learning each other and becoming a team. Fighter pilots were very individualistic. They selected bomber crews based on ability to work and function as a team. I said 9 for the crew. Initially, there was 10 men on the B-17s, 2 waist gunners. As the war progressed, formation flying got better and the Luftwaffe started to get knocked down. They only had a single waist gunner. So they went for a little brief R&R in Lincoln. During that time, Bill's father, he got in touch with him. He had a severe problem with his brain. He needed his head cut open. He was working for Bean in Maine, and he could not afford $5,000 operation, which at the time was an awful lot of money. Bean called his dad into the office, said, here's your train tickets, here's where you're going to the hospital, everything's paid for, come back to work when you're healthy. It was only the second time that operation was ever performed. People came from Italy and China to see it happen. And Bill's father lived quite a long time after that. So during that time, Bill got a short leave and was able to see his dad. Then it was off to Kilmer, New Jersey, and they got ready to go on the QE-2 troop ship, which was not the first time the QE-2, or that might have been the first time, but it has since then been turned into a troop ship capable of holding 28,000 soldiers. All right, so Bill's group flew the B-17s. Is there any B-24 people here? Everybody's got their favorite plane. Bill loved the B-17, as a lot of folks did. He also was a big fan of the P-47, which kind of surprised me. I thought he would have liked the P-51. But the upper plane is the last of the production run. That's a G model. It was the largest. They grew in size a little bit as they went along. 1350 caliber machine guns, 6,000 plus pound payload. That number there, 46915, that's a drawing, but that is actually a plane that Bill flew on. He flew his second mission to Germany on that, and then he flew a couple other missions on that. His primary plane was called the Round Trip Rabbit. 14 of his 35 missions were on the Wabbit, as he called it, but he flew a total of 12 different planes. The plane beneath is an older version that's probably a F model or an E. The difference, as they went on, they stopped camouflaging. There's no point in it. The bomber groups, streams of 300, 500, up to 1,000 bombers escorted by 600 or 800 fighter jets. You're not camouflaging that. There was no point to it. They just left him the plain aluminum. In doing so, the weight of the paint and the friction, they gained 6 miles an hour. Cutaway of a B-17. On the left, you have your officers, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier. Got your ball turret gunner underneath, tail gunner, waist gunner. As I say, I got 2 and an asterisk there. It went down to 1. Radio operator and gunner, and engineer and top turret gunner. Go on. All right, so with the B-17, first thing you had to do was take off. They woke you up real early in the morning. A lot of the guys had bicycles that they'd drive out to the plane to board on, or they get transported by Jeep from the barracks. Typically, you'd get up at 3 a.m., get your briefing. You wouldn't learn the mission for the day till just before you headed out for your plane. Takeoffs were not always easy. Awful lot of crashes on takeoff. Bad weather, England's notorious for the fog and rain. So there's quite a number of cases where a plane didn't make it, just taking off. And the bottom is what's known as a buncher plane. Okay, those were war-weary planes that weren't fit for combat anymore. They painted them these brilliant stripes, colors, polka dots, whatever. They'd take off first, get to altitude, and the formations would gather around them. So you'd have 3 planes to a flight, forget how many, certain amount of flights to a squadron. A squadron was typically 13, 3 squadrons to a group, and then they'd keep latching on with all the different groups lined up, forming a division. There was one bomber stream that went over, I'm pretty sure it was Berlin, and I'm sure it happened more than once. There were so many bombers it took them 2.5 hours to get over the target. Behind the scenes, you have the control rooms. This is Kimballton. It's got a picture of the airfield. To the far right is all the different planes, crew members, whether they're active or not, their status. Over to the left is the mission map for the day. There's an awful lot of planning that went on to these missions. Weather. Weather was a huge problem. Top left, not a bad day over the target. Pretty good visibility. You can bomb in that. In the middle, starting to fog up. Far right, they bombed a lot of times when the visibility wasn't that great. Later on, they had some rudimentary radar that they'd bomb with. Then you progressively get worse and worse. That span of 3 photos and the 2 on the bottom, I took from about, I think it was about 12,000 feet at the moment. That was over the course of 5 minutes. Over the target the same way. Many, many times they had secondary or third target, and they'd break off and go hit the other target on their list. On the bottom far right, that's about 35,000 feet. That's a bit higher than the B-17s were capable of flying at. But at that altitude, they had no oxygen. The planes were not pressurized. They had oxygen systems that they'd either plug into, or they had walk-around bottles that they'd have to put on above 10,000 feet. Typical mission, 60 degrees below zero was not unheard of. In action, top left, B-24, hit by fighter, fuel tanks flaming. 5 parachutes were seen coming out of that. Top right, I believe that's Magdeburg bombing there. They had great success hits there. The upper left of that photo, B-17, you can see the bomb plume rising beneath. Bottom left is a special variant of the B-17 which didn't work out. It was called the YB-40. And it was one solution before the escort fighters, particularly the P-51 with the drop tanks, had a range far enough to escort the bombers the whole way to the target and back. Early on, the escorts had to break off, and the bombers were left all by themselves. The Luftwaffe would wait for that. They knew the fighters were going away at a certain point, then they'd swoop in. So this YB-40 version of the B-17 was outfitted with extra top turret guns, dual guns in the waist. It had a total, I think, of 17 or 19 guns and an awful lot of ammo. And it was so heavy that it took forever to reach altitude, and it just didn't work out. It was a nice try, but it didn't happen. The middle, that's one of Bill's group planes dropping bombs. And on the far right, bottom, you can see all the bomb craters around the bridge there. Very, very tough to hit a linear target like a bridge from 20,000 feet, even with the Norden bomb sight. So they got that bridge real good, but you can see all the hits around it where they didn't get it. Flak, top right is a German 88, very formidable weapon, capable of reaching 10,000 feet or more. very accurate, and the German gunners were very well trained and very accurate. And as we advanced, the flak guns got withdrawn. So the cities we were bombing became heavily and heavily protected with flak guns. So even though we were knocking the Luftwaffe out, flak became much more of a problem. Top left, hit by flak, no one survived. Bottom left, difficult to see. You got contrails from the plane at altitude, which also caused visibility problems. But all the black smudges around here, there's probably 100 in that photo alone. Those are all flak burst. And the same on the bottom right. Flying through flak was not a good time. They got hit by flak once, more than once, but once everybody in the crew got hit. Bill was knocked out of his waist gun position, landed on the ball turret gunner, on top of the ball turret, had to rehook up his oxygen bottle. Go on. It was a tough plane. Each of these B-17s made it home. This one, the whole plexiglass nose was smashed off by a flak hit. On the right, I think that was an Me-109 outfitted with a cannon that took out the tail. I'm not sure. The bottom two are landings that the planes were lucky to make it back. They were crippled and barely made it back to England. When they were approaching the base for a landing, they'd fire a red flare in the air to announce that they had wounded on board, and the ambulances would come rushing out to them. More making it home. The top photo is a classic. That's the All-American. That had a German fighter sliced through it. The wing of the fighter sliced through the whole fuselage of that plane. It clipped all the control wires, virtually everything for control of the tail and stabilizer. They tried to get the tail gunner out of there. As they started pulling him out, the brake at the end started flapping. They realized his weight there was helping the plane stabilize. Part of the wing from the German fighter was in the plane, and they bridged across the gap there with that fighter wing and used the various cords and stuff to stabilize the plane as best they could. The bottom right is a view of that same plane from the rear. They made it. They landed in Africa, but they made it. And the plane literally collapsed right after they touched down and landed and came to a stop. Bottom left is a real direct flak hit. Again, tough plane. They made it home. That picture, the side view of that and others, you could almost drive a Jeep through. That's how big the holes were. So after the missions, a lot went on. You got debriefed. You were allowed a shot of whiskey. The enlisted men were charged with cleaning up their 50 cals. Bunch of activity after a mission, particularly for the ground crews. One mission Bill was on, they got a brand new plane, right straight from the States. So the crew chief said, well, you guys, you got to decosmoline the guns, get them ready. He said, well, you did such a great job, we're going to let you fly this brand new plane. Came back with 278 flak holes. Next. That's Bill's crew. That's the round trip Wabbit. No, it's not. I'm not sure about that plane. I think they flew it around to do crew photos. Because one of the books I'll show you later, that's great reading, has that same plane with a different crew on it. And I've seen it other places. So Bill's primary plane was the round trip Wabbit. That's his crew there. Bill is right there. Yeah, go on. Okay, 35 missions. Initially they had 25. The attrition rate was huge. They extended the guys to 30. Then they extended the guys to 35. Bill, I think the mission allotment was already 35. I don't think he was one of these fellows who was on his 25th or 24th mission and got the word that, hey, guess what? You got to do another 6 more. Yeah. But the missions I'm going to talk about, his first, the 8th, his 11th, the 12th, 14th, and 16th. Some are interesting from his stories. Some are interesting historically. And the 35th, hey, it was his last. So, next. Waist gunner. Photos obviously posed on the ground. He's not wearing gloves. He doesn't have an oxygen mask hooked up yet. He is clean shaven. I think that's a shadow, not a mustache. Bill would give me a hard time if I ever went to visit him and I wasn't clean shaven. I think I only did that once because your oxygen mask wouldn't seal properly. Yeah. So he did give me a hard time once about that. The heated suits, initially they were wired in series. So like the old Christmas lights, if one wire broke, your heated suit failed. They fixed that pretty quick. There are layers of garments there. There's the Mae West vest. There's flak helmets, flak jacket, typical leather bomber jacket, fleece-lined boots. Oh. The waist gunners were at an open window. Roughly 200 miles an hour, 18,000 feet altitude, 40 below. Nice day. That is the Roundtable Wabbit, Bill's plane. That's after 6 missions. Next. Oh, wait a minute, that's mission number 1. Okay, thank you. These are mission reports from mission number 1. You can stay there. Bill's first mission, it's pretty uneventful, except taking off, he heard a thump. A whoosh and a thump. He's looking out the window, and he thought they were really close to the edge of the runway. He was never very fond of his pilot. Most of the crew were not very fond of the pilot. They loved the co-pilot. So they come back, they land safely, landing gear works and everywhere. There's about 6 feet of spruce trees stuck in the landing gear. That was Bill's first mission. Next. I'm not going to go through all those mission reports. They're just details. If you're interested, like I said in the presentation, I can get you a copy. Okay, mission number 8, St. Vith, Belgium. I am not sure why the landing gear failed on this. The Lost Angel. This plane, just amazing. It crashed and got hit, and I believe it survived the war as what they call a hangar queen. That stayed in the hangar and they scavenged it for parts. But on this mission, I forget why the landing gear wouldn't go down. But the pilot, like I said, nobody was really fond of him. Brooksby, the co-pilot, took over. It landed. They slid down the runway, did about a 180. They all jumped out of the plane. Brooksby looks over at Bill and says, "How'd you like that landing, Brownie?" Laughing his head off. Bill was scared to death. Next. Mission notes from St. Vith. Next. Next. Okay, this is the very, very interesting story of the mission to Ingolstadt. They're on their bomb run. When you're on your bomb run, I didn't mention it about flak, but you hit your initial point, the navigator takes over control of the plane. And you do not vary your bomb run one bit whatsoever. You stay steady so that you can hit the target. There is no evasive motions to avoid flak or anything. But in this case, it wasn't flak. They were dropping M17 incendiaries. Plane up and above ahead of them drops their load. The incendiaries are designed to come down as a bundle, and after a certain altitude, break in clusters. While the ones above broke into clusters immediately and hit this plane. This day they were flying this plane called the Hun Runner. So One of their engines is out, another one's not doing good. They're losing altitude. They start throwing everything out. Machine guns, everything they can throw out, they get out of there except for their parachutes. Still losing altitude. They think the altimeter's not working. So they go down, realize that they are pretty damn low. A P-47 comes up, looks at him, shakes his head, takes off. Somebody starts yelling, pull up, pull up. They almost hit a telephone pole. They managed to gain altitude because they jettisoned the ball turret, which was 2,200 pounds. So they got enough altitude, and they were over Belgium. And the story is that McAllister, the pilot, ordered everybody to bail out, which none of the crew members remember happening that way, and he was not the last man to bail out. But anyways, they all bailed out. So the Hun runner just glides itself into a nice, beautiful landing, all by itself with nobody on board. And that's a replica over there of it. So that was quite the story. They were gathered up by a number of locals. They had to retrieve some of their parachutes from some of the locals because the Army would get mad at them. The civilians loved parachutes to make wedding gowns out of, and similar items to that. They spent about a week in France. Their navigator, Elias Saka, said, oh, guys, while we're here, can you give me your money? I want to go to Paris and buy my mother some jewelry. He went to Paris with the money. He had a great time. Didn't show up till about a week later than the rest of them finally got back to Kimballton. So I've tracked down most of the crew members. One of them remains alive. Elias Saka I could not find except in some court reports. And he was guilty of stealing from warehouses in vast amounts. And I talked to another crew member. This was back in '65 when he got arrested by the federal government for racketeering and all this. Another crew member remembered that Saka wanted him to go into business with him. He had a couple old C-47 cargo planes that he was flying back and forth. I forget where, but he was shady. He always was shady. But everybody loved him at the same time. He was one of those kind of guys. Next. The Caterpillar Club, given to those who have successfully parachuted. So that's Bill's Caterpillar Club certificate. Next. Mission reports from Ingolstadt. There's McAllister's statement. Oh, incidentally, they jumped from around 700 feet, which is just about the limit you're going to jump from and still be healthy. Next. Next. Cologne. Okay, Cologne was uneventful for Bill. The mission reports show a few planes shot down, some killed, injured, missing in action. But what was interesting to me about Cologne was we made a lot of effort, the U.S. Air Force did, to not hit the cathedral there. And there's the cathedral, great historic cathedral, and we did a really good job. You can see wreckage everywhere. A photo of Cologne, other than the cathedral, it's just devastation. And, hats off to the guys for pulling that off. That they flew to the target for Uncle Sam. They flew home for themselves, but they did their jobs. They did them well. Mission reports from Cologne. Next. List of killed, missing, wounded. All right, Berlin. 3rd of February, major mission. Bill flew that was his first mission to Berlin. And he flew in the lead group, in the lead position, these massive formations, and he figured he was about the 38th man over the target that day. That raid had over 1,000 bombers, over 1,000 fighter escorts. That is not the round trip Wabbit in the plane. That is that 46915 plane. Incidentally, the first digit on those tail numbers is the year of manufacture. But I put the 46195 in there because he did fly it a number of other times. He did fly it on his third mission to Berlin. And it's also a very interesting story going through it. The literature, there's a report of this. The next mission, Bill did not fly this plane. I think he was back on the Wabbit. The next mission after Bill flew on that plane, it had a mid-air collision with Dallas Dahl. Everybody died. Not true. Plane survived the war and ended up back stateside. Next. Berlin, fairly devastated. Still, it looks better than a lot of the photos I've seen of Cologne. Next. Mission reports. Next. Next. Dresden. Again, another uneventful mission for Bill, but a lot of controversy. And I go back to Tecumseh Sherman. You asked for it, you know. The RAF firebombed it. We followed up the next morning with a mix of incendiaries and general purpose 500-pounders. A lot of controversy that it wasn't a military target. Next. It was absolutely a military target. There was railway yards there. This was late in the war. The Germans were desperately trying to regroup. The Russians were approaching from the east. It was a major transportation center. There was a lot of industrial factories there. There was staff headquarters there, over and over again. The talk about, you know, it was unjust and all that, forget it. You know, and the firestorm wasn't intentional. That can happen, you know, so be it. The chart there on the right, we dropped between the British and us a total of about 7,000 tons on Dresden. We dropped far more than that. Cologne, 44,000. Berlin, 47,000. Hamburg, 39,000. Next. Over 90% of the city was destroyed. A pile of bodies before cremation in the bottom right. It's ugly. People don't want to hear it. But the newer generation should see stuff like this and know why it was necessary. You know, and God bless the men who lived through this. Survived. God bless the ones who died. Next. Mission reports. Next. List of, like I said, Bill's relatively safe on that mission, but list of killed, missing, wounded. Next. 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 All right, mission number 35. That plane had no name, but here is the route that they took. It was a very uneventful mission. They were over the sea most of the time. Entered land very briefly. This is the East Anglia portion of England where most of the bases are located. There.
Is Kiel a canal?
What's that?
Is Kiel a canal?
Kiel was a port or canal or shipping yard. I forget exactly. I believe it was a seaport canal or some type of thing like that. Like I said, towards the end of the war, it was transportation was key, hitting those sites. But this was a very mixed group. I think there was only 2 or 3 members of Bill's original crew on this mission. And it was his last, and I believe it was the 35th for a bunch of others. So I think they gave him an easy mission on this one, too. So, next. Next. All right, this photo I found after the Wabbit had flown 33 missions. I had an awful long time before I actually found photos of the actual Wabbit. But I've found 3 in the archives. So this was long after Bill had completed his tour. Next. All right. So after the war, I'm going to talk very little about Bill after the war. He led the life pretty typical of most World War II GIs. They just wanted to go home and get on with their lives. They didn't start thinking about the war or talking about it till much later in life. So it was later in life that Bill was chairman of the year for the 379th Bomb Group reunion. And Charlie Brown on the left was a member of the 379th Bomb Group, but he was in the 527th Squadron, not Bill's. Franz Stiegler over there on the right, German Luftwaffe ace. He was 1 kill away from getting the Iron Cross. Charlie Brown, his first mission. Next. There they are again, Charlie and Franz. So Bill invited Franz Stiegler to come speak at the convention. Turns out Charlie Brown had been looking for Franz for years. And they were both living about 60 miles apart in Vancouver, British Columbia area. So Franz sees this plane come over his airfield. He needs 1 kill for the Iron Cross. He's a real ace. When he started, his commanding officer told him, "If I ever see you shoot a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." There was a lot of remnants in the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht that were not Nazis. They were true soldiers from the old school. And he was one of them. So here comes Charlie Brown with this plane shot up horribly. Engines out, the works, riddled with holes. Franz can see into the plane, people dying, bleeding to death. All kinds of problems going on in there. He pulls alongside, tells Charlie, "Turn around, you're going the wrong way. Turn around." Finally, Charlie Brown gets it, turns around, and Franz escorts him to the coast. He goes back. Franz, of course, doesn't say a word to anybody. Charlie Brown, at his debriefing, is told not to say anything to anybody for a couple reasons. One, they don't want anybody to have the picture of the enemy as anything but the enemy. They're beasts. They're horrible. We got to kill them. You know, they don't want any of our men to think, oh, that some of the Germans do have a sense of honor. And they also didn't want word getting back to the Germans that this had been done, because he would have been killed. Germans were incredible masters of intelligence. There was many, many men who parachuted out. They got to the German intelligence officer. This happened all the time. German intelligence officer had their whole life story, who they went to high school with, what bomb group they were with, everything. It was incredible. Next. Another depiction of Charlie Brown's plane was called Ye Old Pub, riddled with holes. There's Franz flying off the wing. Next. And that is Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler, and that's Bill's wife, Elaine. Elaine was a sweetheart. We went and visited them a number of times, Bill and Elaine together, and she can bake a hell of an apple pie, I'll tell you that. But Elaine became friends, very good friends with Franz Stiegler's wife, and they kept a relationship for years. Now, in the following slide, don't go yet, you'll notice the dent in Franz's head, and that was from a .50 caliber bullet that came into his cockpit, but it expended a lot of his energy by getting into the cockpit, so it just walloped him but didn't kill him. He has another hole like that in his leg. Okay, next. That's a little note that Bill wrote to me about Charlie Brown and Elaine, etc. Oh, incidentally, at the 379th reunion that was in Framingham, Mass., and when Bill introduced Franz Stiegler, roughly half of the remaining 379th veterans walked out of the room. But they were close enough that they heard Franz and Charlie talking and the story. So they started coming back in, coming back in, coming back in. Finally, they were all back in, and Franz was a hero to them all. So, next. All right, the round trip Wabbit. This is Kingman, Arizona. This is where the planes went to die. They were all, virtually all of them, scrapped. I think there's probably 50 left in existence, if that, a half dozen or so flying. But this is an interesting photo for a couple of reasons. I think it was the best years of our lives. Won a number of Academy Awards, and a pivotal scene in it takes place at Kingman Scrapyard. Now, the round trip wabbit is right there. So I bring this photo that I found. This is the first photo I found of the round trip rabbit. I brought it to Bill. He takes one look at it. He says, it's not it. Well, I know why he's saying it's not it. It's got a square triangle K, wrong air division. It's got green stripes on it, just before the tail and the fuselage. 447th Bomb Group. On the wing is still the triangle K. And before I went and saw him, I researched the history of this, and that plane was transferred from the 379th to the 447th. And the tail number matches exactly, 384666, or whatever, close enough. So I bring it to Bill. He says, no, it's not it. I try to explain it a little bit. No, it's not it. It's definitely it. But who's right, Bill or me? We both are. That's the round trip rabbit. But to Bill, that is not the round trip rabbit. It's stripped of all its armor. It's laying in a scrapyard. It's not. To him, he was right. That's not the rabbit. Now, the rabbit over there, that's Bill's rabbit. That's a B-17. Standing still, with the engines not running, they look like they're ready to launch, man. That wasn't his plane to him. And so we're both right. Next. And there's my buddy Bill, who passed away 27 November 2017. Next. His biography is on the 8th Air Force website. Next. Next. Mission list. My eyes are horrible. You asked about if that was a canal. I can't even read it.
What number?
Number 35, the very last one, on the far right.
Docks and harbor.
Docks and harbor. So, yep. Next. Some recommended books. The Bomber Boys. Those are all Connecticut guys. 5 or 6 of them in there. I believe it's the back cover of that where that photograph 2417 plane is. That is an excellent book. The stories in there are incredible. A man lands in occupied, it was either Germany or France, manages to get back safely without help from a soul, not the underground or anybody. They had money with them. Francs, whatever notes and a silk map. They had a little escape kit, miniature compass, chocolate bars, map of the area they were in, some of the common currency. This guy's walking back, stops in a bar, gets a beer. Bartender starts yelling at him because he can't break a 50-franc note. German soldier next to him pays for his beer. There's one other good story in that book. Man falls out without his parachute, or it doesn't open, I forget which.
Arthur Frechette.
Was that Art Frechette?
Well, that was his story, but I don't know if
I met Art Frechette at Oxford. I have his, Hal Rochette, I think.
I know him. He was there.
Yep.
He told us all about that drop.
Yep. Landed on such a slope of snow and all that he was hurting, but some locals took him in. I mean, it's just fascinating. Book on the right, Stephen Hardin's Last to Die. That plane is a B-38 Dominator, which never really saw combat. It was close to making it. That was in Japan after the truce. Some overzealous Japanese fighters went and shot up that plane and killed one of the crew members. That's a very interesting story too. Next. More good books. That's kind of cut off. Conrad Crane, American Air Power Strategy in World War II. That's a horrible title. He covers air power strategy going back to the philosophy of Khomeini in 1800s or 1700s, all the way through the Gulf War. He does an excellent, thorough job of strategy and why your doctrine should drive your technology, which we did in World War II a lot. Our strategic doctrine drove what kind of technology we were going to produce and make and develop and try. The British, on the other hand, they had what they had for technology and planes. They let that establish what doctrine they are going to follow. The book on the right, Hit the Target, Bill Yen, who made the 8th Air Force great. A lot of names you'd know. And then Snuffy Smith. The only one in there is not an officer. I think his name was Maynard Snuffy Smith. He was a misfit, but he was an incredible hero. A story in there, and it was awesome. When the general came to present him his medal, he was in the kitchen, KP duty, because he was in some kind of trouble. It was typical of him. Next. Mission to Berlin. That's a good story. Rising Sun, Falling Skies, the disastrous Java Sea campaign of World War II. Very little known. Just a colossal blunder. American, British, Dutch, Australians. Together with what we had there initially in the war, we could have done a lot better, but we did not fight with any teamwork and just, it's a great story of how not to handle a situation. Next. Some book reviews I've done for Military Magazine. Give a plug for Military Magazine. It's a small magazine published from California. It is called Just Military, and they're good. They got about 12,000 subscribers. Next. More book reviews next. Next. All right. So World War II is still big. And it's still in the news, it's still important to people. This is from a stamp collector's catalog. Next. This is a man who survived B-17. I forget if he was POW or crash landed or parachuted or whatever. And he's got a great business, but in their recent catalog, there it is right inside the front cover, B-17. You know, next. And they're still flying. Memphis Belle was at Brainerd about 5 or 6 years ago. Bottom right, I think that's aluminum overcast. I should know the name. Pam and I took a flight on it on Bill Brown's birthday. Coincidentally, that's when it was at Oxford. And we got very lucky that somebody gifted us the flight. Next. All right, and finally, there's me and my buddy Bill. And I thank Bill very much. He's given me a lot of great advice over the years. It hasn't just been war stories. He's a hell of a good guy.